Well, Pathway, I have a story I have to share with you this morning to kind of kick everything off. Every week, I have the privilege to sit around a table with all the staff members of our church. We get together once a week, and we always start our staff meeting out as a church by sharing wins, things that have gone right, places where we've seen the mission happen, and we've got a great story to tell, or we've seen a life that's been influenced in some way. Because I never want us to lose the focus on why we're here and why we do this thing called church every single week. Well, this past week at our staff meeting, Dee Capel came to the table with an amazing story. Dee is our children's ministry director, and after she told the story, I was like, man, I have got to share that one with the church because this is awesome. So Dee was in the community this past week, just like going through the community, goes through a store, ends up running into a lady that she doesn't even really recognize. We're going to call the lady Jennifer, not her real name. Jennifer runs up to her and clearly recognizes her and says to her, "Hey, you're with that church, aren't you?" And Dee sort of caught off guard, not sure what to do. "You're with that church Pathway, aren't you?" And Dee said, "Well, yeah, I am. Why do you ask?" And the lady said, "I have got to tell you the influence that your church had on my life." Now, to set this up, you have to understand a little bit of backstory. Some of you know that we used to be located, up until 6 months ago, we were located in the Reno Business Park. So if you would go past Walmart, 3 miles past Walmart, way out there on your left, you would have this big business park, and that's where our church services were at for the first couple of years of our existence. Well, right across the street from the Reno Business Park was this facility called the Oriana House. And the Oriana House was a place where people who had gone through incarceration, they had been in jail, been in prison for something, now they're coming out of that situation, and they would go into the Oriana House for, maybe a 3 to 6 month period of time to help them to sort of transition back into society. They'd get a job in the community, they could leave the facility, they were allowed to come to church. And because we were right across the street, many residents from the Oriana House would walk right across the street on a Sunday morning and would come to our services. Well, this lady was one of those residents. And she said to Dee, "You have no idea how much of an influence that made on me." She said, "I only came there 3 or 4 times. It was all I was able to get over there." But she said, after the first time of coming to your church, she said, "I ran back over to the house, and I told other people in the house they had to come with me." And she told the story of a friend in the house who said to her, "Look, I haven't been in church since I was 13 years old. Churches don't accept people like me. I'm not going over there." And she said, "No, this church is different. You've got to come over." Well, that person came over with her and started attending with her. She said, "When I got out of the Oriana House," she said, "I ran back to my home church, back to the church I had grown up in, that I hadn't been involved in forever. I ran back to that thing." She said, "I ended up giving my life to Jesus. I ended up getting baptized in that church." She said, the church has helped me to start a ministry to my local jail to help women who are in the jail." Isn't that amazing? What an amazing story. Now, I've got 2 reasons for telling you that story. Here's the first of the 2 reasons I wanted to tell you that. I want to give encouragement to everybody here who serves and everybody here who gives financially in this church. You are making an impact. So often when you serve on our dream team, you are in a very sometimes thankless role. When you are serving in kids ministry, waving those flags in the parking lot, setting up the food in the lobby, you're at the new guest station, you're leading a group in your home, you're serving on our marriage team, or you're on our printing team, or some of the midweek behind-the-scenes stuff that happens. There are so many roles that people play to make this all happen, and oftentimes you don't get thanked for what you do. And you have set the table for these kinds of stories to happen in our church. So I want to say thank you to everybody on our dream team. I also want to thank everybody who is a donor in our church, who has chosen to tithe here, chosen to give your offerings here. I know when you write that check and drop it in our offering basket, or maybe you give digitally online, pathwaymarietta.com, maybe you give that way, you often don't know what's the impact of the dollars that I put into this. And I want to thank you for your giving, because your giving is making a difference and is allowing stories like Jennifer's to come to fruition and to happen. We're going to take our offering at the very end of this service today. And listen, if you're a new guest here, please don't feel obligated to give. We are not here for your financial resources today. But for those of you who call this your church home, thank you for giving in this church. Now, the second reason I wanted to tell you that story is this, because it connects to the sermon series that we're actually kicking off today. Isn't it amazing that God remained faithful to this lady even when she had clearly been unfaithful to him. Do you know that God always remains faithful even when we are unfaithful? Do you know that to be true? God does not give up on people. People give up on people. Family members give up on members of their family. Friends give up on their friends. Bosses give up on their employees. Neighbors give up on each other. Church members give up on each other. But God never gives up on people. He never does. And God remains faithful even in the midst of our unfaithfulness. I mean, think of what her story communicates. If ever there were a person that God should have said, you know what, I give up. I'm throwing in the towel. I'm done with my work in her. I don't know what she did to get herself in jail. I have no idea what her offense was that caused her to get there. If ever there should have been a time that we as people would look and say, well, that's somebody God should give up on, it should have been her. And yet that's exactly the opposite of what happened. She gives her life to Christ because God has a bigger vision for her life. She gets baptized because God has a bigger vision for her life. She finds a ministry based out of her pain and her prior experiences because God has a vision for her life. If ever there should have been a place where God would throw in the towel, it would be that. But God never does that. God remains faithful in the midst of our unfaithfulness. Today we're starting a brand new series called Unfaithful, and I cannot wait to get into this series with you. It is a series based out of the book of Hosea and our Old Testaments. Now, Hosea is a very obscure minor prophet that most of you, even if you're a regular Bible reader, you probably have not read Hosea very often, if ever at all. He's kind of buried in the Old Testament. He doesn't take up much space. He's just got a couple pages in the Old Testament for his prophecies. There's a whole lot more text given to the Psalms and people like David and the Kings and the book of Genesis and Exodus. Those are the really big books, the major prophets. But then you've got these minor prophets, these prophets that just have these couple pages at a time in the Old Testament. And Hosea is one of them. And we're going to go through a series out of the book of Hosea that is going to demonstrate to you and show you that God always, always, always remains faithful, even when we, his people, are unfaithful back to him. God's faithfulness is not dependent on our faithfulness. And isn't that good news? Because I don't know how often you screw up, but I screw up a lot. I have been a believer in the gospel message, a believer in who Jesus says he is, for 31 years. When I was 7 years old, I was in a Sunday school class, and Mrs. Burrows, my Sunday school teacher, led us in the sinner's prayer at the end of that Sunday school class. If you don't know what the sinner's prayer is, it's a prayer that I pray every Sunday at the end of our messages. The reason I do that, I'm so passionate about it because that prayer saved my life. Because I prayed that prayer at 7 years old, and Jesus came into my life. And we're going to pray it again at the end of this message today. And if you're here today and you've never started a relationship with Jesus Christ, you can start that at the end of this message today. We're going to give you an opportunity. But Jesus started changing my life at 7 years old. Now here I am 31 years later. I'm now pastoring a church. Who would have thought God would bring me this direction? Let me tell you what I have struggled with for 31 years. I've repeatedly struggled with this. When I've screwed up, when I've sinned, when I have known that God's direction, God's way was this way, and I went this way. And listen to me, pastors ain't perfect people. We screw up just like you do. We rebel against God just like you do. We have all kinds of stuff in our heart that's still a mess that God has to fix, just like you do. And when I'm in the moments where I'm down in the muck and the mire, I am stuck in the mud, I am stuck in the pit, and I just realize that I've been in sin and I haven't followed God. In those moments, for 3 decades, I've wrestled with the question, is God still committed to me? Or is God throwing in the towel on me this time? Because I've sinned one too many times. I've run away from him one too many times. He's finally thrown up his hands in the air. I'm done. I can't take this guy anymore. I can't keep going through this with him. Does God ever become unfaithful to me even when I've been unfaithful to him? Now, I've wrestled with that question for decades. And here's what's interesting about that question. I already know the answer to that question. I'm I'm going to give you the answer to that question today. I already gave it to you. He doesn't become unfaithful. But emotionally, I feel like that's what I deserve. And I wrestle when I'm down in the pit, when I'm down in the muck and the mire of my sin, I wrestle with that question. Is God still committed to me? Is God still faithful to me? Is God done with me? Maybe you've asked that question a lot of times on your journey of trying to follow Jesus. And you know that if you're a follower of Jesus, that you screw up a lot, and you sin a lot, and you rebel a lot, and you run from God a lot, and God has to bring you back and bring you back and bring you back. And maybe you've wrestled with that question as well. When I'm in the pit and the muck and the mire, is God still faithful? Is he still committed? Well, when I was a junior in college, I made a commitment to read the Bible. I had owned a Bible my entire life. I had never read through the Bible. I had read like little sections of the Bible, but I'd never read through the whole thing. So my junior year of college, I made the decision that I was going to read the Bible cover to cover. I was going to start like in the book of Genesis and work my whole way through the Bible, all the way through the book of Revelation. Now, I don't necessarily recommend reading the Bible that way. It can be very confusing, and a lot of it gets repetitive because a lot of the books repeat what other books are saying. It's a little hard to read it that way. But my junior year of college, that's how I did it. So I read cover to cover in the Bible, and when I did that, what I discovered was I came across things in the Scriptures I had never seen before. And I started identifying patterns. And I noticed this pattern that ran throughout the entire Old Testament, where God is working with the nation of Israel. And I noticed that God kept having to deal with the sin of the Israelite people when they would run away from him. And God kept having to say, I'm still here, I'm still faithful, I'm still chasing after you. I might have to put you through some punishment for some time, but I'm still here, and I'm still your God, and I'm going to gather you back to me. I kept on seeing that pattern when I read through my Bible, cover to cover my junior year of college. Well, then I came through the minor prophets at the end of the Old Testament, and I hit Hosea. I had never read Hosea in my life. He's an obscure minor prophet, somebody that most people never even read. And when I read through the book of Hosea, it blew my socks off. I'm not sure there's any book in the Bible that more clearly expresses the faithfulness of God in the midst of unfaithful people than the book of Hosea. I remember sitting there, this passion burning inside of me, thinking someday, I've got to stand up in front of a crowd of people and shout from the rooftops the amazing message of what's in the book of Hosea, the incredible message of what God is telling us through this prophet in the Old Testament. Guess what? That day is here. And we're going to go through this book and see the incredible faithfulness of God. Now, to do it, the way we're going to start this out is I'm actually not going to read you a single verse out of the book of Hosea today. Today is part one of a 4-part series that we're calling Unfaithful. But what I have to do today is I've got to sort of set the theological framework for you. I've got to lay the foundation that you need in order to understand what Hosea is saying. Because when I open up Hosea chapter 1 next week, what we're going to see in the first couple chapters of the book is that God is using an illustration. He's using a metaphor, and it's the metaphor of marriage. And he is calling this prophet Hosea to do something absolutely crazy. We're going to unpack this next week. I mean crazy. He's calling him to do something crazy to demonstrate what his relationship with Israel is like. And what God is doing is he's referring to himself as a husband and the nation of Israel, his people at that time, as his wife. Now, if I just open that up and read it to you right now, you're going to go, this is weird. I've never thought of God in terms of a husband or me or the people of God as a wife. This is really strange. This is really weird. Well, I don't know if you know this, but throughout the Bible, cover to cover, God often refers to himself as a husband and the people he loves as his wife. Or he refers to himself as a groom and the people he loves, his people, as his bride. This is a regular occurrence in the Bible. You won't understand Hosea if we don't lay the foundation for why he does this. I want you to understand the why behind this. What is God trying to communicate with all this husband-wife language, this bridegroom language? What's he trying to communicate that we're supposed to understand? Because we are supposed to understand something about his relationship to us when we read it. And so I'm going to show you verses today, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, where God uses this language. Now, if you are really new to the Bible, it's totally okay if you're new to the Bible, if you don't even own one or understand anything about it. We're glad you're here. We love to teach you the scriptures and help you to understand what they're saying. So let me give you the quick flyover of the Bible to help you to get it. The Bible is broken into two mega sections called the Old Testament and the New Testament, and Jesus Christ is the dividing line between the testaments. So the Bible has 66 books included in it, and in the Old Testament we have 39 of those books, 27 of them are in the New Testament. The Old Testament starts at the beginning of the creation story, and it moves through the narrative of God choosing a certain nation to be his people. It's the nation of Israel. So in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, God calls this guy named Abraham. He says to him, even though you're very old and your wife Sarah is very, very old, you're going to have a miraculous birth. It's the first of several miraculous births in the scriptures. Abraham eventually has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Those 12 sons become the 12 tribes of the Israelite nation. That nation becomes the people through whom God does all of his work. It's who he sends the prophets to speak to. It's who he writes the laws for. It's who he interacts with. The whole Old Testament is a story of God working through this people. Now, we come out of the end of the Old Testament. The Old Testament finishes with the minor prophets, Hosea being one of them. And then we have this 400-year gap of history, and there's nothing happened in the 400-year gap. There's no writings, there's no prophets. God's not speaking at this time. We open up the New Testament, and now we're in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, and they're telling the story of God sending his own son, Jesus, into the world. So Jesus becomes that dividing line that separates out the Testaments. Jesus now lives as the Son of God. He lives a perfect life, never once sins like we do, dies on a cross, hangs on a cross for the sins of humanity, ultimately rises from the dead, and then God, out of the resurrection of Jesus, starts the church. So all these people in Jesus' day believe that he's the Messiah that the prophets of the Old Testament had talked about, and they start to worship him and follow him as God. That's how the church gets started in the book of Acts. So what happens is God changes his focus. In the Old Testament, he's zoned in on this nation of people, Israel. They are through whom he is doing his work. Now in the New Testament, Israel has now opened up, and now the entire of humanity can now come and become a part of the family of God, but only because of the death and the resurrection of Christ. So people are able to put their faith in Jesus and now be included in the church and included in God's family. So whereas in the Old Testament, everything he's speaking and saying is to this people group, in the New Testament, now he's speaking to the church. Now, the folks that would be called God's people were once the Israelites. Now God's people are the church. It's you and me. It's all of us connected with the global church who would say that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Son of God. He died on a cross. He saved us from our sins. We put our faith in him. We now are considered God's people. And what's interesting is that in both the Old Testament and in the New, God refers to himself as a husband and as a groom, and his people as a wife and as a bride. And I want to show it to you. The first major place where this shows up in the Bible is in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a much more significant prophet in terms of the amount of writing that he does that's in our Bible. Isaiah has like 60-some chapters to it. It's a very significant book in the Old Testament. Now, Isaiah was writing, and he was prophesying around the year 700 BC, and he's speaking to the Israelite people. Now, here's what you need to know about Isaiah. Isaiah's words were actually crafted for a future people. So 115 years after Isaiah's life, the nation of Israel, who are God's people, would be swept over and taken over by Babylon. Babylon is going to rise into power. Babylon is going to sweep over the earth. Babylon is going to crush all of their neighbors. Babylon is going to come in under King Nebuchadnezzar and utterly destroy Jerusalem and haul the Israelite people right out of their capital city and take them into the nation of Babylon. This is all going to happen in 586 BC. So when Isaiah is writing, he has two purposes with his writing. One of them is he was meant to be read by these future captives in Babylon who were going to read what he had written earlier, what God had said through him. So one of the reasons he wrote was to explain why they had to go into captivity. What were their sins? What were they doing? What was it that caused God to have to allow this punishment to come on them to take them to captivity? But the second reason Isaiah is writing is because these people who are under Babylonian control are really going to need hope. Because they're going to feel like God has given up on them. They're going to be in captivity for 70 years. For 70 years they're going to be in captivity. And they're going to feel like God's done with us. God threw in the towel on us. God's finished with us. And Isaiah is writing to say, no. God never was done with you. Because God always remains faithful. And the way he does that is to speak in this imagery, this vivid imagery of a husband who wants his wife back. So here's what Isaiah says. Chapter 54, toward the end of his book, writing to these future captive Israelites. He says, listen, do not be afraid. You will not be put to shame. Do not fear disgrace. You will not be humiliated. You will forget the shame of your youth and remember no more the reproach of your widowhood. So he's saying to these future captives, read my words. You're humiliated. You're in shame. All the nations are laughing at you. You've been crushed by the Babylonians. It's time to remove your shame. You need to have some hope. You're not going to stay in shame and disgrace any longer. And then he goes on to explain why they're not going to stay in shame and disgrace. Verse 5, for, he says, your maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He's called the God of all the earth. He's saying, listen, you people, you Israelites, you who are God's people, God views you as his wife. Your maker, your creator, views himself as your husband, and he ain't done with his wife. Listen to what he says, giving them hope now in verse 6. The Lord, your husband, your maker, will call you back as if you were a wife deserted and distressed in spirit, a wife who married young only to be rejected, says your God. This is the first major time in the Bible that God uses this kind of imagery, this husband and wife language. It's strange. We read it and we go, well, I don't think of God that way. That language falls outside of my paradigm of who God is and what kind of relationship he wants to have with me. It's very unique language that God is using here. There's no other religious perspective, no other religion at all that would say that the gods that they worship would view themselves in this way. This is totally unique to the Christian God, to the God who sent Jesus into the world. And Isaiah continues it on because at the very end of his writings, right at the end of his book, chapter 62, he's writing words of hope still to these future captives who are in Babylon needing hope. They're 150 years later, they're reading this stuff going, God hasn't abandoned us. Because listen to what he says, verse 3 of 62. He says, you people, you will be a crown of splendor in the Lord's hand. He goes on, he says, you'll be a royal diadem in the hand of your God. He's saying, God's not done. You're going to be a crown in his hand again. You're going to be a crown in his hand again. Listen to what he says, verse 4. No longer will they, that is the surrounding nations, who look at you, no longer will they call you deserted or name your land desolate, but you will be called Hephzibah and your land Beulah. Hephzibah literally means the words, my delight is in her. Beulah literally means the word married. And he goes on and he says, for the Lord will take delight in you and your land will be married. Here's all that marriage language again. Verse 5, as a young man marries a young woman, so your builder will marry you. So your builder will marry you. I just love this. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? Isaiah keeps saying, God is a groom, you're his bride. God is a husband, you're his wife. He's not done with you. Yes, you've had to be punished. Yes, you've had to be driven into Babylonian territory because of all the unfaithfulness. Don't mistake something here. Unfaithfulness does lead to problems. And sometimes punishment from God. But what Isaiah is saying to these people is God has not abandoned you. Everybody else around you may have given up on you. You may have given up on you. But God has not. He remains faithful. Now we get into the New Testament now. Post-Jesus, the church has been birthed, and now God's focus moves from Israel to the church. He's opened up his arms to the nations to come to know Christ, and God uses the same language in the New Testament. Have you ever heard us be referred to as the bride of Christ? Are you understanding now where this language is coming from? We're the bride of Christ. That language is used in the New Testament. Here's one right here, Revelation chapter 21. In the book of Revelation, John was one of the disciples of Jesus. And John is given this incredible vision of the end times. And he's trying to write down like this crazy vision that he's seeing. I mean, crazy vision that he's seeing. And he writes it, it becomes the book of Revelation. It's a very difficult book to understand in our Bible because it's using all these allegories and all these illustrations and all this imagery that we don't know, is it literal, is it metaphorical? It's a very perplexing book. But one of the things that John sees at the end of the book of Revelation, and he writes it down, are these words. Listen to what he says, chapter 21, verse 1. He said, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." He's at the very end of time now. And he says, "For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea." He said, "I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared," here it is, "as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband." And he says, and I heard a loud voice from the throne, that is God's throne, saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among his people, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God." So here's John. He's trying to write down what he's seeing, and it's perplexing. And he's seeing this city come down out from heaven, but the city isn't an actual city. The city is a people. And the people are the church. It's all the saints who have gone to their grave and found themselves in the presence of the Lord. And now the whole city, all the whole group of people are now coming down out of heaven. And John's trying to say what he's seeing is that, wow, they're like a bride. They're dressed like a bride. And there's going to be this wedding, and God's going to be the groom, and he's going to marry his bride. You see, the language continues, Old Testament and New. And if you don't understand why God keeps using this language, then you'll be confused when we open up Hosea next weekend and are trying to demonstrate the faithfulness of God in the midst of the unfaithfulness of his people. Because it's using all this marital language is going on in the first 3 chapters of Hosea. So maybe you're wondering, well, why in the world does God keep on doing this? Why? He's clearly committed to using this language, to describing himself in this way. And I think God has earned the right to define himself how he wants to define himself, right? So even if this falls outside of our paradigm of who God is, he's saying, make it your paradigm, because this is who I am. Why in the world would God do this? Well, you need to understand that any time you're reading metaphors, you're reading illustrations, you're reading these vivid illustrations in the Bible, Old Testament or New, God is intending those illustrations, he's intending those metaphors to teach you something. He uses things we understand as people to describe this very complex thing of who is God. He uses events, he uses circumstances, he uses things like family or things like water or things like bread to describe who he is and what his relationship is to us. And so here he's using wedding and marital language. Why is he doing it? Well, he's doing it because we understand it. We get marriages. We get engagements. We get wedding ceremonies. Now, since I've become a pastor these last couple of years, I've had the privilege of participating in a number of different wedding ceremonies. Now, when I was getting married, I got married almost 14 years ago. This summer we'll be hitting 14 years for my bride and I. Very, very proud of that reality. Now, when Janet and I got married, we had a part of our ceremony that you have seen at a wedding, which was the lighting of the unity candle. So I came with one, little flicker that had a flame, and I lit one candle, and Jana lit another one, and we then took the two candles, and we brought the candles together, and the two flames became one flame. And then we blew out our flames and left the one flame. And you all understood what that meant. Like, you understand what that means when you see that at a wedding. Well, now bride and groom, man, they're becoming so much more creative these days. Like the unity candle, not as many people are using that. I'm starting to see more things. I'm seeing like unity paints and unity sands. I'm seeing cords that are getting braided together. They're all saying the same thing. So one of the weddings I went to not too long ago, the bride and the groom had sands in it. And, the groom had the red sand and the bride had the blue sand. And they went to like a vase and they started to pour their sand together. And I had to read this thing that kind of described, as the sands are blending together, so these two lives are blending together. And from this point forward, these two lives that are coming together on this wedding day can never be separated. They'll never be apart again. And in the same way that you could never possibly get these sands apart, you will never be able to divide these two again. From this point forward, the sand is intermixed. Husband and wife are together forever. Now, if I came to you and I said, hey, I would love for you to take this sand, dump it on the floor, separate the red grains from the blue. I'd like to separate it back out. You'd throw the vase at my head because you could never do it, could you? There's no way, from this point forward, this sand will never be separated. It can't be. It's impossibly small. It's too difficult. We understand what this means when we go to a wedding, don't we? So what do you think God might be trying to tell us with all this bride language and this marriage language, this husband and wife language? What's he trying to tell us? He's trying to say, when you became my people, we became like this. The moment you put your faith in my son Jesus, you decided to follow him, from that moment forward, you made an undeniable link with me that you can't get away from. And no matter how far you may run, no matter how deep in the muck and the mire you may get, no matter how unfaithful you might be at times of your life, we are together forever, and it is never going to change. God is faithful. We're going to see this language next week in the book of Hosea, and I want you to think of this image right here, that God is faithful. When God looks at his people, he is so deeply in love with his bride, and he's in love with you. And if you're here today and you've put your faith in Jesus, you are a part of the people of God. You're a part of the church. And God, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, God will be after you for life because he's got a vision for your life. Just like he had for Jennifer and her incredible story, he's got a vision for your life. And you need to know that throughout this series.